Good afternoon, subscribers, and thank you for joining me once again. Today I'm looking at labour market theory, and this is of particular interest, I'm sure, to those of you who are in year 13. I certainly have just started this with my year 13 microeconomics students. So we've already done all of the market structures, which is a big chunk of the year 2 specification, and now we move to labour market theory. Very interesting part of the specification, and also, nota bene, ladies and gentlemen, one for which it's pretty certain, pretty likely, that you'll usually get some type of question on this. Okay, so what am I going to look at today? Well, ultimately, I'm going to finish by looking at how we derive equilibrium in the labour market when we're considering a perfect market. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about where the demand for labour curve comes from and where the supply of labour curve comes from before we get to the equilibrium position. So let's get moving on it, ladies and gentlemen. So point number one, very important point. We always talk about the fact that labour is a specific type of demand, indeed it is a derived demand, i.e. the demand for labour comes from something else. So the demand for builders, for example, the demand for bricklayers comes from the demand for houses. The demand for shipbuilders comes from the demand for ships. You get the idea of derived demand. And the demand for labour is really determined by the marginal revenue of the labour. In other words, if I employ an additional employee, well, as a firm, let's think about this. Why am I employing that person? Well, I'm employing that person because I think that they can generate for me a revenue which is in excess of what it costs me to hire them. So if it costs me, let's say, £40,000 annual salary to hire somebody, well, I'm hoping, as a businessman or woman, that they will generate revenue which is above and beyond the cost of employing them. And so the demand for labour is derived from this notion of marginal revenue. Remembering the definition of marginal revenue, which is the change in total revenue, or the addition to total revenue from, in this instance, employing one additional worker. Well, what determines how much extra revenue a worker can contribute to your firm or organisation? Well, we consider two things. Now, of course, we are talking about economic theory here, and so this is the theory. We're keeping this nice and simple by limiting this to two factors. And those two factors are as follows. Number one, how productive is the worker? And number two, the price at which the good or service that the worker is producing, the price at which it retails. So how much you're going to earn as a consequence of selling it. So let's talk about how productive the worker is, first of all. Well, you'll already have come across this notion of productivity when you looked at the law of diminishing returns. Now, I've got a video on the law of diminishing returns. If you're not familiar with it, go back and have a look at it. I'm not going to go over it again here. But the general gist of that is that the efficiency of labour or land, but primarily labour when we're looking at LDR, law of diminishing returns, is described as their marginal physical product, the MPP, the marginal product of somebody. But in labour market theory, we're just tagging on this additional word physical. So we're talking about the marginal physical product of labour. So how efficient they are at producing whatever it is that your firm produces. So that's productivity. And then, of course, the second thing which determines the marginal revenue is, well, once your employer has produced something for you, how much can you sell it for? So what is the selling price? So we've got the MPP of labour, how productive the labour is, and we've got the price of the good or service which the labour is producing. Now, if we take those two factors as being the determinants of the demand and we multiply them together, MPPL multiplied by the price, then we get this term, the marginal revenue product of labour, or the MRP of L. Now the fact that it's marginal revenue, this should be familiar to you, especially once you've looked at market structures. But another term to describe that then is we're also saying that this MRPL is also effectively the demand for labour. Now let's just talk in a little bit more detail about this whole notion of the productivity of labour. So in this theory of the law of diminishing returns, where you're combining a variable factor, which is usually labour, with a fixed factor of land, what happens is that the efficiency of the labour and the land, the combination of those two things, in the first instance, the efficiency improves, and then it starts to diminish, hence the term, the law of diminishing returns. And so we say that the marginal product rises, and then when diminishing returns set in, the marginal product starts to fall. Well, if we are basing the demand for labour on this particular scenario, because we're talking about the marginal physical product of labour, all we're really doing is we're taking the shape of this curve and we are transposing it to a labour market's axes, if you will, where we've got the wage and the quantity of the labour, and we're now saying that this shape of curve here, we're saying that that is the demand for labour curve, the marginal revenue product of labour. So once I've looked at how efficient my labour is, and I'm multiplying by the price of the good that I'm selling, then this is the shape of the curve that I will get. Now, we're assuming here that in the perfect market, we're always going to be selling the product for the same price. And hence we're able to say that this curve mimics this curve. Okay, so that's the demand curve for labour. Let's now consider supply and equilibrium. So let me just very quickly move this along. Very high tech, I know, ladies and gents. Just move that along like so. Okay, what about the supply of labour? So we've dealt with demand. Well, in a perfect market, we're assuming that the firm can employ as many units of labour as it wants at the same wage. Now, this is an ideal. So remember when we were talking about the goods market and perfect competition, where we assume that the demand for the good is perfectly elastic because you can sell as many goods as you want at the same price. Now that's highly theoretical, and here again we're talking about theoretical notions. So the employer can employ as many units of labour at the same wage as it wants. Now if that's the case, W star being the going wage, that will just be a perfectly elastic curve. And we can say that W equals AC equals MC. So let me just very quickly run through what I mean by that. So if the wage is 10 for everybody, because it's a perfect market, and quantity of labour, so we've got 1, 2 and 3, well, what will the total cost be? Well, the total cost will be 10, 20 and 30. What will the average cost be? So that's our AC here. So it'll be 10 over 1, which is 10, 20 over 2, which is 10, 30 over 3, which is 10. So it's our average cost. And then what about our marginal cost? So the extra cost of employing one additional unit of labour. So when we go from 1 to 2, that's a marginal of 10. When we go from 20 to 30, 2 to 3 rather, 20 to 30, that's a marginal of 10. So MC at the halfway points is also 10. So here we can see that W is equal to AC is equal to MC. And of course that in effect is also our supply curve of labour. So that's how we derive the demand curve and the supply curve. Now obviously, as is the norm, we put those together to get equilibrium. So there's W star Q star, that's our equilibrium. And let's not forget this whole notion of rationality and decisions being made at the margin, very important in our economics. So why would it be rational to employ right up to this point and maybe irrational to employ, let's say, Q1 and not go beyond that? Well, if we employ Q1, the differential between marginal revenue and marginal cost is quite substantial. So the extra revenue generated by that very efficient worker with a very high marginal revenue product is much greater than the cost. So very worthwhile employing that particular person. What about Q2? Worth employing? Of course. Not quite as efficient, however, still a significant differential between their marginal revenue and their marginal cost. So it's rational to employ all the way up to the point at which the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue product. Now, you will be familiar, if you studied market structures before, that the profit maximizing output rule under the goods market for market structures is that firms maximize profits where MC equals MR. Well, here again, ladies and gentlemen, we can say the same thing. MC equals MRP. So the profit maximizing level of employment in this instance is the point at which the marginal cost is equal to the marginal revenue product. To go beyond that would not be rational necessarily, especially if we're just considering profit, because let's say that's Q8 person, the cost of that person is much larger than the additional revenue that that person brings in. And why is that? Well, it's because that person has a lower marginal product or a lower marginal revenue product. Therefore, they are less efficient. And as a consequence of that, it would not be rational to employ that person. So in that instance, we want to cut back. But if we're here, we want to continue to expand the business, as it were. Okay, ladies and gents, that's it for today. That is our derivation of the labour supply and demand curves. Bye for now.